Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the indispensable shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. And my co-host in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and a practicing magician. Eliot, our listeners noted that when you spoke about it, and I think by popular demand, we may have to have you and John McLaughlin do a show for us on magic.
Well, I think that would be a great idea. I can guarantee that, when you do this as a podcast, they just can't see how you do it. Eric, I'm looking forward to this session about a book about somebody for whom you worked. I know who's one of your heroes. So I'm actually planning on asking pointed questions, not only of our guest, but of you as well. So you're forewarned.
Forewarned is forearmed. I'm ready to take whatever outrageous spears and arrows you chuck my way. Our guest is Philip Taubman, a consulting professor at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. But before he joined CSAC, Phil was a reporter and editor for the New York Times for some 30 years, and I suppose full disclosure requires me to say that when he was serving as the New York Times Moscow correspondent, he and I overlapped while I served at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Phil, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, as I mentioned when we were in the green room before we got started, reading your book occasioned a bit of a bout of PTSD in me, having lived through so much of what you wrote about. Tell us a bit about how you came to be George Shultz's biographer, and if you could, let our listeners know what you think this biography brings to the burgeoning literature, now based on real historical sources, of the Reagan administration.
So the origins of the book go all the way back to the days when I was covering George Shultz as Secretary of State. I was a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times at that point, and covering mostly defense intelligence issues, but got drawn into diplomatic coverage, took some travels with him, including a trip around the world. And then later, when I was posted to Moscow by the Times, I had a vantage point to cover his efforts along with President Reagan's during the time that Mikhail Gorbachev was Soviet leader, at least for the first 3 years of Gorbachev's leadership. The relationship, was a professional reporter public official relationship, and it sort of drifted off after he left the job of Secretary of State, and I went off and did other things at the Times. It rekindled when I retired from the Times in 2008 and set up shop at Stanford to write books. And the first book I decided to do was a book about the effort of George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry to abolish nuclear weapons, which seemed a surprising effort on the part of all four of them at the time, at least as I began work on that project. And as I was working on that book, I hadn't finished it yet. Shultz came to me one day and asked me if I'd be interested in doing his biography. And there was no biography. Mine is really the first. Which is kind of surprising when you think about it, given the historic role that he played in winding down the Cold War. And to, motivate me, I guess, he said, I'll give you exclusive access to my papers at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And so I dipped into those papers while I was still working on the other book, and I found a lot of valuable material there, including an amazing diary that had been kept by his first executive assistant as Secretary of State, Raymond Seitz. So when the time came that I finished the nuclear book, I went back to him And I said, I'd be very interested in doing your biography, but I think we have to have a clear understanding about the nature of the book I'm going to do. And the way I put it to him, I said, George, it's your life, but it's my book. And I have to have complete editorial control over it. He immediately agreed. And frankly, over the 10 years roughly that it took me to complete the book, he never once tried to get me to revise the book in a way to reflect what he thought was a more favorable account of his role as Secretary of State or in any other part of his life. So I think you asked about the historiography here. I think with the benefit of things like the Ray Seitz diary and the benefit of declassified materials and the benefit of many interviews that I conducted with colleagues of Shultz's and Reagan's, I think one can begin to distill a sense of core events and dynamics in the Reagan administration that may have been a little obscure, I think, until the last 5 to 10 years. And I think what you would find in my book that illuminates that point, I think most specifically, is a sense of the vital, really indispensable role that Shultz played as Reagan's partner in winding down the Cold War and dealing with the Kremlin. I think the book also, an argument you may disagree with a bit, having been at ringside yourself, is my sense that Reagan was struggling in his first term to execute the diplomatic dimension of his policy to deal with the Soviet Union, and that it really took George Shultz to show Reagan a path forward diplomatically that would take advantage of the things that Reagan had done to put the Kremlin on the defensive in his first term.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the book about Reagan's rhetoric, the belligerence of some of that rhetoric, both in the campaign in 1980 and then in the early years of the Reagan presidency. I don't think you fall into the trap that a lot of people do. I'm thinking in particular of our colleague at Johns Hopkins, Jim Mann, who wrote a book about the difference between the first and second Reagan terms. I don't think it's as stark as Jim paints it on the evidence of your own book. From the outset, from what we know now from his diary, Reagan was intent on negotiating with the Soviets and had a strong streak of nuclear abolitionism in him, but was beset by difficult divisions inside his own administration. But how would you characterize his view of containment? I mean, to me, it seems like one that is pretty much in consonance with George Kennan's argument in 1947 in the Mr. X article that containment applied judiciously against the Soviet Union's expansionism would ultimately lead to, as Kennan said, either the breakup or the mellowing of Soviet power. Do you see Reagan as diverging from that in some fundamental way?
Well, what I see is I think that the Kennan doctrine of containment was modified over time. I agree with your description of it. But as the Cold War played out, different strategies were tried by different presidents in the larger effort to sustain a policy of containment. Détente, for example, was a modification that stressed the potential convergence of the two societies, the possibility of reaching agreements that seemed to accept as a given that the Soviet Union would be there forever. And I think when Reagan came in, certainly Reagan and many of the aides around him believed in trying to confront the Soviet Union in a way that I don't think one could say some of his predecessors had done as directly. And he did that. there's no doubt, and I think my book goes into detail on this. He used a lot of belligerent rhetoric, invested with the assent of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, billions and billions of dollars in building up America's defenses. He approved and advocated the Strategic Defense Initiative, which, while at least in my view, and I think the view of a lot of people at the time, was technologically unrealistic, had the advantage of adding to the sense in the Kremlin that the United States was advancing in ways that it might not be able to match. So he did all those things. But as I say in the book, it really took Shultz to provide the diplomacy to execute on the steps that he had taken. And you alluded yourself to the infighting. I mean, it's just incredible how much opposition Shultz faced in trying to take basic diplomatic steps with the Kremlin. The people around the president seemed to be implacably opposed to almost every diplomatic initiative that at least Shultz thought might be successful at the time. So I think, yes, Reagan was consistent with Kennan in some ways, but I think he also went a step beyond Kennan in some senses with the kind of hostile confrontation approach that he took at the outset of his presidency.
So I'd like to push back on both of you. Eric, I don't think Reagan's understanding of containment was anything like Kennan's. Kennan was appalled at the idea of a military dimension of containment, and it was actually a much more passive kind of construction. Reagan, and I recall our session with Will Inboden. I think Will is right that Reagan did have this vision of putting pressure on Russia, on the Soviet Union, and negotiating with it, to be sure, but only after it was, as Phil has said, really on the back foot, and he was willing to press. Now, Phil, I'm not so sure I agree with you either, because it seems to me, for example, you quote National Security Decision Directive 75, which a lot of people talk about, which is the one where it's talking about over time containing and over time reversing Soviet expansionism. Well, given when this was taking place, after the Russian occupation of Afghanistan, that's not entirely unreasonable. Competing with them militarily, again, given where the United States was in the 1970s, not unreasonable. To promote within the narrow limits available to us the process of change in the Soviet Union. I think, it's an understanding of limits, but something that not unreasonable to press. And then it says to engage the Soviet Union in negotiations to attempt to reach agreements which protect and enhance U.S. interests. Well, that's kind of the job of the president. Now, obviously there were fights in the Reagan administration, as there always are. And people like Dick Pipes, was an old professor of mine, was probably a lot harder on the Soviet Union than perhaps Shultz was. But I guess the point that I would make is, from Reagan's point of view, this all kind of fit together. That is to say, he had a vision of putting the Russians on the back foot, as you said. One part of it, which the book doesn't really go into, is a very active promotion of a insurgency in Afghanistan against the Russians. And then, when the time came, there would be negotiations, and he was always, to some extent, open to that. So I hate to say it, but in some ways, this makes me think more and more highly of Reagan as having been able to, while everybody thinks that he's kind of out of touch and unable and is, to some extent at the mercy of his subordinates, he actually got what he wanted, which makes me think that maybe he wasn't a puppet.
Well, my estimation of Reagan changed considerably in the process of doing the book. I ended up thinking much more favorably about him as I did the book than I felt when I began the book. But I do think that the missing element in the Reagan strategy, and I'm not sure it was as clearly thought out by Reagan as the belligerent kind of language he was using and the military buildup that he was investing in. I think, was the diplomatic part of it. And, once Shultz came in as Secretary of State, he tried repeatedly to get diplomatic overtures going with the Kremlin beyond the stalled arms control negotiations, which were kind of static at that point. And it was the fortuitous combination, as I describe in the book, of a blizzard and Nancy Reagan that kind of was the breakthrough to get some kind of discussion started. Early on, this would have been, under Andropov. But that was an amazing moment retrospectively when you look back on it, where Nancy Reagan, anxious that her husband was being wrongly depicted as a warmonger, saw Shultz as an ally in trying to develop a more positive legacy for her husband. And then she took advantage of this blizzard that paralyzed Washington in February of '83 to invite the Shultzes over for dinner. And it was that night at the private quarters of the White House that Shultz really got his first full sense of what Reagan wanted to do, and that it included diplomacy. And even because of that dinner, the first constructive, granted very minimal bit of diplomacy began, which was the effort to get the Pentecostals who'd been holed up in the American embassy in Moscow freed so that they could go out onto the street and not get arrested, and then would be allowed to emigrate.
But isn't the only real opening for diplomacy would come once you had Gorbachev?
Well, sure.
There wasn't really room for a serious diplomatic initiative when, you had this sort of deteriorating KGB veteran in the shape of Andropov, for the other superannuated leaders who were all one by one dying in office. They were not really going to be in a position to negotiate anything worth negotiating. So doesn't all this really hinge? I mean, I in no way mean to diminish George Shultz's role, but it's the arrival of Gorbachev that makes the really big difference, and Reagan deciding, as did Maggie Thatcher, this is somebody we can do business with.
Right. Well, look, we'll never know what might or might not have happened with Andropov and Chernenko. You're quite right. They were dying as they took office, and they were gone, in a matter of months in both cases. But the reality is, if you look at it just within the context of the American side, an effort to even see what was plausible and possible with these kind of elderly Soviet leaders was kind of stopped before it ever could get started because of opposition around Shultz in the administration. And I would say, and I think it's an important point, that Shultz was really, I think, clairvoyant in understanding when he met with Gorbachev at Chernenko's funeral in 1985 in Moscow, that Gorbachev was a game changer in the Kremlin. And I think Reagan picked up on that when he got to Geneva for the first summit. But Shultz was the advocate of that against a tidal wave of internal material coming out of the CIA and the Reagan administration saying that Gorbachev was just a fresh face on an old policy.
Yeah, I want to dig in a little bit more on the White House side of this, Phil. But before I do, I want to defend my honor, which my co-host is impugning here with regard to Kennan. I think one has to distinguish, by the way, between the containment strategy as articulated by Kennan in the X article, which was then picked up on by lots of people, as Phil said, in different permutations and combinations, and what Kennan himself later made of it. In the end of the day, you're right. I mean, he claimed retroactively that he had no intention of suggesting that containment should be a military doctrine, but purely just a politico-diplomatic doctrine. But that's not the way the article actually reads, nor did most people who read it take it that way. And the language is pretty clear. Contain the Soviets until either breaks Soviet power or it mellows. I mean, that, remains what was in the X article.
Well,
So,
we should be talking to our guest, but since you fired a shot back, I'll fire another one back at you, which is, I mean, it seems to me that the thing that's distinctive about Reagan is the aggressiveness. That, whereas Kennan thought if you hold the ring around the Soviets, the internal dynamics of the regime would bring it at some point to either mellowing or the point of collapse, and there was some merit to that. What was distinctive about Reagan was the intensely competitive approach, which was shaped by people like Pipes, who I think does deserve a lot of credit for that, which he followed on. And I very much take the point that Shultz early on detected that Gorbachev was indeed a different kind of character, and I think it's interesting that it's both him and Thatcher who picked up on that much more quickly than the rest of the U.S. government did. But I think there was a kind of willingness to really lean forward and really press, which I don't think was really envisioned in the original containment policy.
No, I would go further and say that one of the things that's distinctive about the Reagan approach, and it's enshrined in both NSC 32 and 75, is the notion of competing with the Russians on a variety of different levels, including particularly economic, where Reagan thought we had a huge comparative advantage, but also contesting their gains in the Third World, which had been a place where, American efforts at détente earlier, as Phil was talking about, had foundered because of Soviet aggressiveness in the Third World during the Carter years. Phil, on the White House side of this, though, you were talking about the people trying to restrain Shultz. And again, I think you do a masterful job using Ray's diaries of outlining, just how frustrating and consistent, a lot of this bureaucratic infighting was. But in the White House, there were divided councils. I mean, you talk about the role that Mrs. Reagan played in that dinner, but well beyond the dinner. There was also Jim Baker and Mike Deaver, who clearly had a different view than Ed Meese, who was the senior counselor and longtime Reagan aide. Even in the NSC itself, Judge Clark had one view, and Dick Pipes had a view, but Bud McFarland's view was, quite different. And McFarland worked on and off with Shultz, sometimes at cross purposes with Shultz, but frequently in sympathy with Shultz. It was not kind of a unified White House against George Shultz. It was, a kind of mixed bag of shifting alliances. And then, you did have the Cap-Weinberger phenomena, which we should come back to, because it's really a fascinating relationship, and I'd like to come back to.
So let me elaborate on it a little bit, because I think, yes, there were allies. Jim Baker, certainly, as chief of staff, Mike Deaver, deputy chief of staff, and Deaver, of course, was very close to Nancy Reagan.
And he controlled the schedule.
Yeah, he controlled the schedule. But the preponderance of heavyweights in the national security circle around Reagan were not in agreement with Shultz. You've got Weinberger, don't forget Bill Casey, CIA, who had a seat at the table in those days. Gene Kirkpatrick, UN ambassador, who was at least nominally a cabinet member in the Reagan administration. So, a lot of the heavyweights were in opposition to what he wanted to do. And I think one of the things that I found so striking that's in the Seitz diary, and I understand that, some of what Seitz is recounting is George Shultz venting at the end of the day. He comes back from meetings of one kind or another at Defense or the White House, and he's deeply frustrated and he vents. But even if you discount for that, you see the number of times that Shultz made an effort to get a diplomatic track going, and it gets swatted down in one way or the other. And to go back, I think one of the most dramatic instances of that to me was, I had alluded earlier to the post-Blizzard dinner diplomacy to try to get the Pentecostals out of the Soviet Union. Bill Clark, the national security advisor, was quite aggravated by the idea that kind of came up in this dinner at the White House between Shultz and Reagan, that the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin should come over to the White House. Reagan hadn't met Dobrynin yet, other than going over to the Soviet embassy to sign a condolence book about Brezhnev when Brezhnev died. And so Shultz, with Reagan's agreement, takes Dobrynin over to the White House, and they meet in the family quarters. And the meeting, which was supposed to last 10 or 15 minutes, goes on for 90 minutes. And it turns out that Reagan's really interested in engaging with the Soviet ambassador. And out of that discussion comes this Pentecostal diplomacy. So within a few days of this meeting, I think it was Bud McFarlane describing Bill Clark's attitude about this Pentecostal diplomacy and the meeting between Reagan and Dobrynin, says to the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, says, the only reason that Reagan said those things to Shultz at dinner was he wanted to appease his wife, Nancy. So to me, that was a really kind of back alley way of trying to undermine Shultz. I mean, to believe at that point that Reagan was just trying to appease his wife, I don't buy that.
Yeah, although, I mean, in a sense, Shultz had the last laugh because Nancy ends up pushing Bill Clark out.
He did, and indeed, Clark was pushed out, I think, largely through the back maneuvering of Nancy Reagan. But it just shows you, I cite that example just to show the degree to which some of the folks around Reagan were trying to block Shultz.
I have to say, as I think back on my memories of this period, that's quite a while ago, everybody was appalled at the nefarious influence of Nancy Reagan, consulting astrologers, so not a clue about any kind of policy, let alone foreign policy, let alone arms control, and now she's a hero or heroine. It's, maybe it's just the, the odd quirks of history, but it's, I mean, this way goes back to an earlier comment that Eric made, that it is interesting that we're only now getting real histories of the Reagan administration. And I'm sure we're going to go through several cycles of evaluations and reassessments of some of the key personalities.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Phil said about Shultz venting. I mentioned when we were in the green room that Ray would have these sessions with Shultz after the end of the day and going through whatever business they needed to go through, and then getting Shultz's sense of what had happened and meetings at the White House that Ray might not have been privy to. A lot of times there are late day phone calls coming in while they're meeting, including from the First Lady and from the President and Clark and other principals. But the venting was real. I mean, and so everything you described is very accurate. But as someone who was living in the middle of this as George Shultz's special assistant and who was getting briefed the next morning by Ray about not everything that was in the diary, but a lot of what was in the diary in terms of Judge Clark and Weinberger and this and that, it didn't feel quite as beleaguered as the end of day venting might make it sound, because Shultz was very, very busy doing bunches of other things, getting the extraterritorial sanctions on the Yamal pipeline that had been one of the issues that precipitated Al Haig's resignation resolved without blowing up the NATO alliance in order to facilitate the deployment of the intermediate range nuclear forces that was part of the dual track decision inherited by the Reagan administration, ultimately leads to the INF treaty. Actually helping negotiate at Williamsburg at the summit in the spring of '83, a joint statement among the G7 leaders that welcomes the actual deployment. Now, Phil, you tell a very true story about what happened, which was a whole bunch of stuff about Nicaragua blows up at that point, including the effort to mine the rivers in Nicaragua and ports and all of that. But at the same time, he was doing these other things that he was succeeding at doing that were also important. So as I mentioned, it a lot of times felt like a rugby scrum, but Shultz said to us that he particularly admired one of the assistant secretaries who would go in and, get involved in the rugby scrum, fight for what he could, make allies with whoever's an ally that day and maybe different allies the next day, but dust himself off every day and go back into battle. And my sense at the time when he said that was very much how he perceived himself, as, going back into battle and fighting with all this, although it was obviously enervating to continue to run into all these fights, and did precipitate, as you document, several efforts to use the leverage he knew he had after Al Haig's secretaryship blew up, and Haig was fired actually by Reagan, but had threatened to resign repeatedly. The Reaganauts knew that it would be very, very bad for the president, particularly before an election in 1984, if Shultz were to resign. So he knew how to leverage that. I'd be interested in your view of that, but also to go back to the Shultz-Weinberger relationship, which is really fascinating. I remember early on in his tenure, Secretary Shultz was asked whether he thought he could get along with Secretary Weinberger, because Weinberger and Haig had famously been kind of at each other's throats in the first year and a half of the Reagan administration. And Shultz said, with malice aforethought, "Oh, absolutely, I can get along with Cap. He's worked for me before," because he had been Shultz's deputy at OMB, and he had been the general counsel for Bechtel when Shultz was the president. And Shultz, I think, genuinely thought that he had a chance to build a better relationship with Weinberger than Haig had. And I can attest to the fact, as your book documents, he was very hastily disabused of that notion. But the Shultz-Weinberger relationship just seems to take on such an aura of personal animosity. And I'm just wondering, after all your research, is what you made of that.
So first, to go back to your observation about, Shultz's sort of sticking it out and having some successes, even in Reagan's first term. When you look back at Shultz, people ask me what were the character traits that defined him and accounted for his success. And I think two of them were very, very conspicuous in that first term: patience and persistence. He just stuck it out. He put together resignation threats a number of times. He either pulled back from them or Reagan wouldn't accept them. But he was a man of uncommon patience, I would say, and he kind of waited out his opponents in some senses, and then history broke in his direction in the second term. In large part because Gorbachev appeared in Moscow and made possible things that might not have been possible in the first term. On the Shultz-Weinberger relationship, it's a fascinating dynamic, and I think it goes to a larger point about the force and personality plays in shaping history, which is often underestimated, I think. And this is a classic example of two men who, for reasons I think I don't completely understand, had a very unfriendly relationship in some ways during the Reagan administration. You cited some of the factors that might have led to a degree of resentment, I think, on Weinberger's part. He always seemed to be the person with the less prestigious job, whether it was in the Nixon administration or at Bechtel, even at their respective camps at the Bohemian Grove in the summer. Shultz was at the more prestigious camp than Weinberger. And this somehow carried over, into the Reagan administration. Colin Powell, whom I interviewed about all of this, he said he understood it completely. It was basically, George was the boss through the years, and then suddenly they show up together in Washington, and Weinberger is in a position of equal power to Shultz, essentially, and he's no longer a subordinate. And he seemed to enjoy exercising his authority in ways that aggravated Shultz. There's a moment at the beginning of the Shultz's term as secretary that frankly amazed me. There was going to be a weekly or regular breakfast, at least, between Shultz and Weinberger. And it's just within a matter of weeks of Shultz becoming Secretary of State, he goes over to the Defense Department. They have breakfast. They get into an argument over whether M1 tanks should be sold to Saudi Arabia. Shultz opposes it. Weinberger favors it. Weinberger, at least according to Shultz, goes into a long kind of argument in favor of the sale. At that point, Shultz looks at Weinberger and says, Cap, everything you just said was incomprehensible. It was like, whoa, the Secretary of State is talking to the Secretary of Defense about that, like 3 weeks into his secretaryship. So there was a bristling hostility between them that played out in ways that were probably constructive at times because they gave Reagan, opposing views on various issues. But I think at other times it was destructive.
They had some interesting principle disagreements. I think the one that is actually quite significant as you think about American attitudes towards the use of force, you don't really talk about it that much in this book, but Weinberger articulates his, I think there were 6 principles for the use of force, which were, clearly a reaction to Vietnam, and which would be extraordinarily restrictive and in many ways completely unrealistic. And Shultz responds in a speech, and then actually I think they kind of have one more exchange of speeches. They're never on a podium together to talk about this, but it is conducted at a pretty high level. I mean, they are both trying to articulate approaches that make sense for the United States that has recovered from Vietnam in some ways, but in other ways still bears all the scars. So I think that, I give them both credit for engaging at that level, as well as the, personal pushing and shoving of 2 alpha males.
Yeah, look, there was no question it was high-end policy disputes that animated their relationship, but there was something going on beyond that that affected the relationship. And you're right. They were often on opposite sides on the use of force, with the Secretary of State advocating the use of force and the Secretary of Defense opposing it. Shultz told me a number of times that the worst day of his life was the day of the truck bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon in '83.
I was the one who woke him up in the middle of the night to tell him about it.
He felt terrible because he was himself a former Marine, but also because he had been the primary advocate of putting the Marines into Lebanon on the ground, and Weinberger had opposed that. And then you could see that argument reappear because of the terrorist strikes in Lebanon during that period, where Shultz was pressing hard for a retaliatory military strike against the terrorists in Lebanon and in Syria. And Weinberger was deeply opposed to that. So it was both, policy conflict of a high order and personal animosity of a high order, I would say.
I wanted to ask you about Shultz in the Nixon administration, but maybe we can do that now or discuss it later. What do you say, Eric?
Well, my question actually goes to that. So why don't I ask my question and Phil can answer both. One of the relationships that's really fascinating here, and because you've written another book about, as you mentioned, about Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and Sam Nunn and Bill Perry's effort to follow up Ronald Reagan's nuclear abolitionism, if you will, is the relationship between Kissinger and Shultz, which, of course, begins in the Nixon administration. But it's really quite, phenomenal because you document here, as Henry, I'm saying this advisedly, as Henry approaches his 100th birthday, George having died shortly after his, at multiple points in the Nixon administration, before he gets into the Reagan administration, at the end of the Reagan administration, when they have the summit in New York City with Gorbachev, Kissinger is either privately undermining Shultz or directly publicly criticizing him. You note that the New York summit and Kissinger's criticism in I think it was the Washington Post, if I recall correctly, ends up eliciting a kind of waspish letter from George complaining about the public criticism. Yet out of office, they end up becoming very close colleagues, including on the Four Horsemen op-ed that you've written a book about, but also on multiple other issues where they wrote joint op-eds together. And Kissinger ends up saying there's no American I would more want to entrust the fate of the nation to than George Shultz. How do you explain that relationship? And maybe you can talk about Shultz and the Nixon administration at the same
that's
time.
A fascinating relationship. And I think, the way it ended up in their latter years as a seemingly close friendship in many ways, and an alliance of sorts on the nuclear weapons issue, I think that's attributable to a charitable streak in George Shultz, who was willing to forgive Henry for the sniping that went on during the Reagan years. So if you back up to the Nixon administration, they were allies in a way at that point, although in different spheres, clearly. Shultz was not much involved in foreign policy in the Nixon administration, and Kissinger was at the center of it. But towards the end of the Nixon administration, as the president was getting engulfed by Watergate and drinking heavily and seemingly to act increasingly erratically, Shultz and Kissinger would get together periodically to talk, to make sure that the government wasn't running off the rails as the Nixon administration was essentially disintegrating. Then you fast forward to the Reagan years, and Kissinger was doubtful about Shultz's qualifications to be Secretary of State, thinking that Shultz lacked the necessary background in foreign affairs and arms control issues, and in dealing.
Certainly not as qualified as Henry.
Well, nobody, of course, is as well qualified as Henry, which in some ways is literally true. But he let the White House know that he didn't think that Shultz would be a good candidate to be Secretary of State, which, by the way, Nixon agreed with at the time. So Reagan goes ahead and brings him in to replace Haig. And then once Reagan and Shultz began to do business with Gorbachev, Henry was writing columns in those days, and he kept sniping at the effort to work out deals with Gorbachev. And you mentioned at one point, Shultz got really hot under the collar about a column that Kissinger had written, and wrote back a rather curt letter complaining about the sniping that was coming from Kissinger. So throughout the Reagan administration, there was, you could not describe them as friends, certainly not in terms of their public communication. But once out of office, I think, George saw advantages in befriending Kissinger and vice versa. And then clearly there were mutual benefits to be had, starting with Shultz's effort to bring together a group to call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And he thought, rightly so, that if I can get Henry Kissinger to sign up for this, it will give our effort a huge boost. And indeed it did. Although I think, Kissinger's commitment to that cause was probably less kind of heartfelt than Shultz's.
Yeah. So the question I wanted to ask you about the Nixon years, I found one of the really fascinating parts of the book come quite early on, where it's towards the end of the Nixon administration. And here's George Shultz, who is by all accounts an upright man, someone of real integrity. I think that was, part of what attracted people like my friend Eric Edelman to him. And yet he's working for a guy who ultimately he knows is somewhat unprincipled and devious. And he decides to stay on, but he knows that maybe he should quit. And the way you describe it in the book, you quote Arthur Burns' journal, in which he says Shultz is a very sad man, and then I think Burns says Shultz is tired, but I think he likes being secretary too much to give it up. And I think that it's a particularly interesting moment because Nixon was a much better character than Trump, Lord knows. But, we've had another presidency recently where you have good people wrestling with, working in very, very high office for somebody who they know is unprincipled and devious and possibly criminal. It hadn't really occurred to me that Shultz went through his own travails. And I wonder if you could share anything with that. Did he reflect on that later in life? Do you think he regretted any of the choices that he made? Just curious to know how he processed all that.
It's a good question. So the example, I'll just describe it very briefly, that brings us to the fore is Nixon's effort to weaponize the IRS against his opponents. Shultz, being Treasury Secretary at the time, is supervising the IRS. It reports to him. And after Shultz and the IRS Commissioner, Johnny Walters, rebuffed an effort from the White House delivered by John Dean, the White House counsel, to weaponize the IRS against a long list of Nixon's enemies. They blocked that, but then the White House came back subsequently and said, we want the IRS to examine the tax returns of Larry O'Brien, the head of the Democratic National Committee. And Shultz acceded to that. And Johnny Walters, the IRS commissioner, later looked back on that and criticized Shultz, said he was disappointed that Shultz let that go forward. John Ehrlichman at the White House sort of browbeat Shultz into doing this. And it was a moment where I think Shultz did not live up to his own ideals or values. And when I confronted him with all of this during research for the biography, he at first didn't want to hear about it. He seemed stricken when I brought it up. And eventually, we got into a conversation about it. And the counter argument, the defense he made at the time was that, Nixon had done many good things as president. He had tried to defend Larry O'Brien when it was clear after the IRS investigation that O'Brien hadn't done anything wrong. And in fact, the IRS cleared O'Brien. And then vis-a-vis Nixon, his argument was essentially, if I had left, someone else would have come in who would not have stood up against these kind of efforts by Nixon. So that's an argument you hear in Washington when very senior officials are serving under presidents that they have come to realize, are engaged in unethical or even criminal conduct. And I think George regretted that effort with O'Brien. And the other thing I would attribute that to was a sense of loyalty on Shultz's part that, when he signs up to serve with the president, goes to the title of the book, In the Nation's Service, he really felt an obligation, a patriotic duty to serve. But in that case, I think he stayed on too long. With Nixon, he resigned only 2 or 3 months before Nixon did.
Phil, I wonder if I could get you to comment on two things, because we're running out of time, and I want to go ahead and give Eliot kind of the last word. But one, George Shultz as negotiator. What your sense? I mean, this is someone who was a labor economist, had been Secretary of Labor, had been involved in any number of labor management negotiations. So he might not have a lot of foreign affairs experience when he becomes Secretary of State, but he's got a lot of negotiating experience that's pretty relevant. And my sense of him was that he was actually a damn good negotiator. I mean, you recount in the book the very fraught session he had with Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, after the shoot down of KAL-007 in Madrid. The meeting was in Madrid. Shoot down was over Sakhalin, or a little after that, I guess, over Russian territory. But one of the things that struck me about that meeting was which I don't think is captured in any of the interviews or the documents that you were able to look at, is what Shultz told us afterwards, which was he told Gromyko that he'd been instructed by Reagan that the only thing they could talk about was the shoot down, and to get the Russians to own up to it and apologize and make restitution for the families that had been killed, etc. And Gromyko got very angry, as you say. It was probably one of the most contentious, confrontational meetings between an American Secretary of State and a Soviet foreign minister in the history of the Cold War. But the thing that Shultz told us that was interesting was that Gromyko went to the door to walk out and looked back and it was clear to Shultz that he was looking back, expecting Shultz to come out of his chair and come get Gromyko and keep him from walking out. But that Shultz just sat there, kind of Buddha-like, until Gromyko realized that Shultz wasn't going to come after him, and that Shultz was content to let him walk out the door. At which point he came back and sat down, and they continued to have an exchange of unpleasantries for another hour or so. So I'd be interested in your sense of Shultz as negotiator based on the work you did for the book. And then the other thing that struck me about Shultz as a subordinate, bearing in mind the cliche that no man is a hero to his valet. I mean, I always used to say that George Shultz was the living exception to the rule, because really I think all his former special assistants idolized him, and we were the ones carrying his bags on those trips. Shultz really got more out of the career Foreign Service than any secretary I saw during my 30 years in government. And it wasn't because, as Kissinger and Nixon and others believed, that he would become the captive of the State Department. I mean, you have many instances in the book where he basically tells people, get with the program or leave. The president makes foreign policy, and we get to execute it. We get to advise him, but he's the one who calls the shots if you don't like it. He really imposed Reagan's agenda in some ways on the Foreign Service, but also used that subject matter expertise, I think, to great advantage. So could you comment on those two observations? Am I wrong? Or
No, I think you're quite right. Shultz had a formula for negotiations that grew out of his time as a labor economist and someone trying to help the captains of industry and labor union leaders to resolve disputes and avoid strikes or settle strikes. And the formula was very simple. It was essentially, if people come together and argue over principle, they'll never get to agreement. But if you bring them together to solve a problem, they'll solve the problem. And I think he applied that rule to diplomacy. And I think you can see it once he had an interlocutor in Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister under Gorbachev. That's exactly what they did over and over again, was to sort of disaggregate the ideological and political dimensions of the relationship, set them aside, and tackle the problems inherent in the relationship. And, that came up ultimately, in resolving the mini crisis over the arrest of Nick Danilov, the U.S. news correspondent in Moscow, which, I think had it not been for those two men in their seats at that time, that crisis might have extended a lot longer. And probably there never would have been a Reykjavik summit that came out of that dispute. And out of Reykjavik ultimately came the INF agreement, though not, in Reykjavik, but later. So I think, George had a real kind of gift for sort of taking the passion out of issues and trying to look at the substance of them and figure out where common ground could be found. I think, the phrase that I would use above all others to describe George Shultz is pragmatic problem solver. You can see that across his career, really.
So let me ask one last question. He passed away in, if I remember correctly, February of 2021. My impression is that he was really quite sharp to the very end, was paying attention to public affairs. you describe him as a pragmatic problem solver. He's clearly a very deep patriot. I am curious, what's your take on how he understood the political turmoil of the last years of his life? Trump administration. This is, whatever Trump is, that's not the Republican Party of George Shultz, even though I don't think he was really willing to go out there and denounce him very sharply in public. But what was his view? I mean, he, one of the last statesmen, probably the last statesman of that generation, which had, fought in World War II and been through all that.
Well, he was deeply unsettled by the Trump presidency, and it sort of crept up on him. He could tell during the 2016 campaign that Trump was steering the Republican Party off in a kind of dark direction. But he was reluctant to say anything publicly. He finally did issue a joint statement with Henry Kissinger on the Friday evening of Labor Day weekend in 2016, which is, as you Washingtonians know, is probably you put out a press release on the Friday of a holiday weekend, it's going to get zero coverage and attention. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. But they did say in their joint statement that they would vote for neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump, which, considering that they were two diehard Republicans, was an important statement for them to make. And they did say that whomever was elected, however, they would be glad to assist after the election. And then as the Trump presidency played out, he became increasingly disturbed by what he saw. I did a joint appearance with him at the Olympic Club in San Francisco one day at lunch. This was midway through the Trump presidency, I think. And George pulled from his pocket to answer a question, a speech that Ronald Reagan had given as president, extolling the importance of immigration in American history. It's a stirring speech. If you go back and look at it, it was an eloquent defense of immigration as a phenomenon that has re-energized the United States over and over again over the decades. So he was certainly disturbed by Trump's immigration policies, and he became increasingly, I think, unsettled over foreign policy management. Although, the disarray in the Trump administration over foreign policy was acute too, as it had been in Reagan. But in Reagan, it was all within the bounds of what we would consider normal debate about policy issues. In the Reagan administration, it was kind of out of bounds, often with crazy stuff going on, the president either condoning or seeming to ignore. So, by the time George died, he was unable really cognitively to speak up much anymore about these issues. But I can tell you, having had private conversations with him, he was appalled at the Trump presidency.
We could go on for hours, literally, talking about George Shultz, who, as Eliot said at the outset, is one of my heroes. Our guest has been Philip Taubman, the author of In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George P. Shultz, the first really full biography, the only biography, I believe, of one of America's greatest 20th century statesmen. Phil, thanks for joining us on Shield of the Republic.
It's been great fun. Thank you.